Just some strange, unfortunate coincidence. But then he saw it. Her tiny, fragile frame. Her clothes worn and dirty. Her belly swollen in a way that made his heart sink. It wasn't just a curious moment. It was a cry for help. The girl, unaware of the chef's gaze, continued her search through the refuse, seemingly desperate. The chef's stomach churned. There was something deeply wrong here. It wasn't just poverty. It was something more. He had worked in kitchens long enough to recognize the signs of hunger, of a life that was struggling far beyond what he had imagined. His mind raced. What could have led this child to this point? What kind of life was she living that would bring her to this alley, scavenging for food in a place most people would never think twice about? He knew he couldn't just stand there, watching as the child's suffering went unnoticed. This was bigger than a simple act of kindness. It was a moment of urgency. The chef's instincts kicked in, and without hesitation, he pulled out his phone, dialed 911, and calmly explained the situation. He didn't know if the girl had parents, if she had a home, or if anyone was looking out for her. But one thing was clear. She needed help, and fast. The dispatcher's voice on the other end of the line echoed in his ear, assuring him that help was on the way. But as he hung up, a heavy weight settled in his chest. The girl's condition was concerning, and the chef couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this than just a child in need of food. As the minutes ticked by, the chef kept his eyes on her from a distance, wondering how something so heartbreaking could be happening right in front of him, in the middle of a bustling city. The chef had seen a lot in his years, things that would make most people turn away, but this was different. The urgency of the situation was palpable. This child, alone and hungry, represented a story far too common, one that he hadn't fully understood until now. But what would happen next? Would help arrive in time? Who was this little girl? And what had driven her to such a desperate place? As the sirens approached, the tension grew. The chef's heart pounded as he prepared for what was to come, knowing that this moment would mark the beginning of something much bigger than he could have ever anticipated. Stay tuned as we uncover the shocking truth behind this encounter and learn the unexpected twists that would soon unravel the fate of the little girl and the chef, who risked everything to help her. This is a story that will make you think twice about the world around you and the hidden struggles people face every day. As the sirens grew louder, the chef's mind raced with questions. Who was this little girl? And what had led her to such a desperate state? He had lived a long life, one full of ups and downs, but he had never encountered anything like this before. He had seen the struggles of families in his community, some barely scraping by, others battling addiction, homelessness, or abuse, but the situation before him felt different. There was a certain helplessness in the girl's actions that struck a chord deep within him. She wasn't just hungry, she was lost. It wasn't long before a police car and an ambulance screeched to a halt by the restaurant's back entrance. The officers and paramedics quickly assessed the scene. One of the officers, a man in his 30s with a stern face, approached the girl carefully, trying not to startle her. The little girl froze, her wide, frightened eyes locked on him. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, too afraid to move, too afraid to speak. The chef, who had been watching silently from the doorway, stepped forward and spoke up. "I found her digging through the trash out back. She's been there for a while, and she doesn't seem well. Her stomach..." He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. He didn't need to explain more. The sight of her small bloated belly was enough. The paramedics approached the girl slowly, speaking in soft, reassuring voices, but she flinched at their touch. The officer crouched down to her level, trying to break the tension. "Hey, sweetie, can you tell us your name? he asked gently. The girl's lips quivered, but no words came. She looked up at him, eyes filled with fear, then glanced toward the chef, almost as if she was seeking reassurance from the stranger who had called for help. The chef's heart ached as he realized the girl wasn't just physically hungry. She was emotionally starved, terrified, and lost. She had no one to trust, no one to turn to. The officer looked back at the chef, as if silently asking for help, unsure of what to do next. The chef stepped forward, his voice calm, yet firm. She needs more than just food. This isn't a simple case of hunger. There's something else going on here. The officers exchanged glances, clearly unsure of how to proceed. But before they could say anything, the little girl's voice broke the silence. "I'm not supposed to be here," she whispered, so quietly the chef almost didn't hear it. "They said I could stay in the alley, just for a little while." Her words sent a chill down the chef's spine. "They?" he asked, bending down to her level, trying to keep his voice steady. The girl nodded, but her eyes darted nervously toward the restaurant's back alley, as if she feared someone might be watching. The tension in the air thickened. The officers didn't press her any further, sensing the trauma behind her words. One of the paramedics stepped forward and gently placed a hand on the girl's shoulder. "You're safe now, sweetheart. We're going to take care of you." But even as the paramedics led the girl toward the ambulance, the chef couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something wasn't right. He had seen enough to know when a situation didn't add up, and this one was full of holes. Who had left this little girl alone? What had happened to her family? And why was she so afraid to speak? Was someone out there still watching her? As the ambulance doors closed with a heavy thud, the chef turned to the officer who had been leading the scene. "I don't know if it's my place, but there's something off about this. She's not just a homeless kid. She's been through something. Something worse." The officer sighed deeply, rubbing his forehead as if trying to make sense of the puzzle. "We're going to figure it out. Don't worry. We'll track down her parents, or guardians, or whoever's responsible for this." But the chef wasn't so sure. He had seen enough to know that some problems didn't have easy answers, that sometimes things went deeper than anyone could understand. There were people out there who didn't want to be found, people who could make a child like this disappear and leave no trace behind. As the sirens faded into the distance, the chef felt an unease settle over him. He knew that what had started as a random encounter, finding a hungry, desperate girl in the trash, was far from over. He didn't know how or why, but he could feel that this was just the beginning of something bigger, something dangerous, something that would change not only the little girl's life, but his own as well. He couldn't just let it go. The girl was out there, and whatever story she had, it wasn't over yet. He had already taken the first step by calling 911, but now he found himself wondering if he had done enough. Should he have done more? Could he do more? There was no turning back now. The chef didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was clear: he couldn't walk away from this, not after everything he had witnessed. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty. News of the little girl's disappearance spread throughout the local community. There were whispers and rumors, but no real answers. The restaurant became a place of quiet tension, with staff members gossiping among themselves, wondering if they had missed something. And the chef? He spent his nights lying awake, replaying the moment over and over in his mind, trying to piece together the fragments of the girl's life that he had seen in that fleeting moment. Then, one morning, as he stood at the stove, preparing breakfast for a new batch of customers, he received a call that would send his life in a completely different direction. It was the officer who had been at the scene. "You're not going to believe this," the officer said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "We found her, and what we uncovered? It's worse than we could have ever imagined. The chef's heart pounded as the officer began to reveal the shocking truth behind the little girl's story. And in that moment, everything changed. The chef's heart was racing as he listened to the officer on the other end of the phone. The officer's words hit him like a punch to the gut. The little girl, the one he had seen digging through the trash, was not just another homeless child. She was part of a much darker story. Her name was Emma, and she had been missing for weeks. Reported by no one, because no one knew she was gone. Her family wasn't a typical family, at least not in any sense the chef could have imagined. It turned out that Emma's mother had been struggling with severe addiction for years, leaving her child to fend for herself most of the time. The father, he had been absent from her life for as long as Emma could remember, leaving her with a mother who, despite her love, was trapped in a cycle of neglect. But there was more. Emma's mother wasn't just battling addiction. She was trapped in an abusive relationship with a man who had used and manipulated her for years. It was this man, someone Emma had been too terrified to speak of, who had forced her to stay in the alley, telling her she would be safer there than anywhere else. The officer told the chef that the man had been arrested for a string of offenses related to domestic abuse, but Emma's mother had been so brainwashed, so controlled by him, that she hadn't even realized her daughter had been missing. By the time the authorities pieced the full picture together, Emma had already slipped through the cracks, wandering, starving, and clinging to the last shred of hope that maybe someone would care enough to notice her. The chef felt a lump form in his throat. How had he not seen it? How had he not recognized the signs of such a broken, desperate situation? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that it wasn't his fault. He wasn't a social worker or a therapist. He was just a man who saw a child in need and did what anyone with a heart would do. He called for help. Still, the revelation left him unsettled. Emma had been living in fear, not just for her safety, but for her mother's life too. As the chef listened to the officer recount the horrifying details of Emma's past, he felt a deep, gut-wrenching sadness for the life she had been forced to live. A life where survival wasn't just about hunger. It was about staying alive, day after day, in a world that didn't care for you. The officer then told the chef that Emma's mother had been taken into custody for her own safety and was now on the road to recovery. The first steps toward healing had begun, but the journey would be long and fraught with challenges. And Emma, she was in the care of a foster family who had already shown deep compassion and love for her. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was a start, a real chance for Emma to have a future free from the shadows of abuse. The chef couldn't help but feel a sense of relief as he hung up the phone. The story that had started in an alley behind a restaurant had ended with hope. Not just for Emma, but for everyone involved. The rescue, though messy and painful, had given this little girl a chance she might never have had otherwise. It was a bittersweet conclusion to a tragedy, but the chef knew that sometimes all you could do was offer a hand, call for help, and trust that someone out there would pick up the pieces. Days passed, and the chef returned to his routine, but something had changed in him. The world had always seemed large and overwhelming, filled with so many problems he couldn't possibly solve. But Emma's story had reminded him that even in the darkest places, there were moments of light, moments where one person could make a difference. He wasn't the hero of this story, not by any means. But his actions, no matter how small they seemed, had set a chain of events in motion that had ultimately led to Emma being saved. As he stood in his kitchen, prepping another batch of orders, the weight of the experience settled in. He realized that every life, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, mattered. That sometimes the only thing standing between a person and their survival was a simple act of kindness, a willingness to act when the world seemed indifferent. The phone call from the officer had changed the course of the chef's life. It had opened his eyes to the hidden suffering that went unnoticed in the daily bustle of life. It had reminded him that even in the face of overwhelming hardship, there were people out there, people like him, who were willing to step in, to stand up for what's right, and to make sure that the world didn't forget about the ones who needed help the most. When Emma's case was finally closed, the community rallied together. Neighbors helped support Emma's new family, making sure that she had a safe and loving place to call home. The chef, too, found ways to give back, donating time and resources to local shelters and food banks, doing everything he could to make sure that other children like Emma wouldn't have to face the same fate. In the end, it was a reminder that the world wasn't as cold and heartless as it sometimes seemed. Small acts of kindness could ripple out and create waves of change. The chef had been part of that change, and though the journey wasn't over, he knew that he had done something meaningful. As for Emma, she would grow up, no longer having to dig through trash for her next meal. She would have a future, filled with possibilities she had never before dreamed of. And perhaps, when she looked back, she would remember the man in the kitchen, the one who saw her when no one else did, and know that she was never as alone as she thought. The story may have started with a girl in the trash, but it ended with hope, a hope that no one is ever truly lost. If someone is willing to look and reach out,